Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Spirit Alive. I would like to welcome back all of you who attended the first webinar, and thank you for the many kind words of appreciation for Beth Johnson and Tom Petriano, who got this series off to a great, thought-provoking start. For those of you joining Spirit Alive for the first time, my name is Maria Pascuzzi. I'm the director of Spirit Alive, which is a new ministerial outreach supported by the Sisters of St. Joseph, Brentwood, New York. We all welcome you and are very glad that you could join us. Tonight, friends, we are asked to consider what it means for each of us to be awakened and transformed by the fire of God's love as we focus on racism. Racism is a reality that many refuse to acknowledge or engage by way of constructive discussion. Various reasons have been advanced for this, from the naive assumption that we live in a post-racist society to our discomfort in speaking about a system of racial injustice, which we know is wrong, but from which we benefit, to the insistence that speaking about racism does nothing to unify, but only furthers divisiveness. Whatever the reason, the refusal to confront the reality of racism, the unequal social status and injustices that result from it, and the reasons for it, creates a dangerous situation of racial illiteracy and ignorance. And that allows the evil of racism to continue to afflict our society and our church, which, despite its teaching about the sin of racism and its destructive effect on society, remains, according to some African-American Catholic bishops, a place where, quote, racism, at once subtle and masked, still festers. Tonight, we are here to listen respectfully and openly about race and racial issues so we can take a small step in overcoming that ignorance. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, we are here to open ourselves to God's Spirit alive among us, a spirit of renewal and transformation, who awakens in us the fire of God's love, so that we might learn to love as God loves, beyond the limits of race. Now, I would like to turn tonight's webinar over to our host and respondent, Sister Mary Ellen Kane, CSJ, who is the current Executive Director of the United States Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Mary Ellen has spent her life ministering among and advocating for the poor and disenfranchised. She has served on various national advisory boards, has extensive experience in training and community organizing, and in 1978, she co-founded Providence House, Inc., Houses of Hospitality for homeless, abused, and formerly incarcerated women and their children, and she lived there for 18 years. So it's my pleasure to welcome and turn over the webinar to Sister Mary Ellen Kane. Mary Ellen?
Thank you, Maria. Good evening, everybody. As Maria said, I am now the Executive Director of the United States Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph. I am in my second year in that position. But for 16 years previous to this, I served as the Parish Life Coordinator at St. Mary Magdalene Parish, a Black Catholic parish in Springfield Gardens in the southeast section of Queens. One of the joys of my time at St. Mary Magdalene, and there were so many, was sharing in ministry with Deacon Ernie Hart. During these years, Ernie's titles changed many times. He was judge, then justice, professor, and now deputy commissioner of the New York City Police Department. But one thing that never changed was Ernie's uncommon faithfulness and his commitment to serving his community, both inside the church and in the wider community. During these years of ministering together, Ernie and I challenged each other with books and articles and spent many hours in discussion, oftentimes on the issue of race and racism, and the effects that these had on the people in our community, especially the young people. These have always been growing and learning experiences for me, and I hope tonight they will also be growing and learning experiences for you. So now I am very happy to introduce my friend, Ernie Hart.
Thank you, sister. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to, first of all, thank Sister Maria for inviting me to present this evening, and to Sister Mary Ellen for hosting this presentation. Perhaps discussions involving race are probably one of the most uncomfortable topics that most people will ever encounter in their lives. Uncomfortable for so many reasons. One may be fear of being labeled as racist, depending on what they may say. Maybe they are racist, but don't want anybody to know. Maybe you are indifferent to the issues. Maybe you don't even know. But I'm sure there are a myriad of reasons. Throughout the history of recorded time, race and religious differences has been at the forefront of human relationships and the inability for peoples to get along. This is quite evident in Scripture, where the divine response is continuously love your neighbor. And that was certainly the theme of last Sunday's gospel. But as I think about the topic of race and the limits it imposes on following Jesus's commandment to us that we love one another as he loves us, I'm struck by the realization that race, racism, and/or the differences between us has been a constant barrier to realizing our Lord's desire for us. We all know that it has been a particular problem for us in the United States since our country's inception. Race has defined our politics, race has defined our neighborhoods, race has defined our social structure and our education, and race has even defined the way we worship. I ask you to think for a moment. How would you define race? How would you define racism? In the present context, race can be defined as any one of the groups that humans are divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of a shared ancestry. And the world has basically divided itself into 4 or 5 racial groups. Interestingly enough, there seems to be a difference of opinion as to what they actually are. In our country, we generally categorize racial groups as white, Black, Asian, Native American, maybe Pacific Islander, maybe Aborigines if you were in Australia. However, when we think of racism in the United States, operationally in many ways, legally, the categories increase to such things as ethnicity, religion, and country of origin. Racism itself is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or person on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. I am one generation removed from a time when the church in Brooklyn, and remember that until 1957 or so, the Brooklyn diocese covered all of what is now the Diocese of Rockville Center. My mother and my grandmother told me the stories of how they had to fight to worship in a Catholic church because of their race. They lived in Brooklyn at a time when Black people were excluded from churches because of segregation. They told me of the time when they went to a particular parish in their community, and that church was called Nativity. It had a sign on the door of the church that said Negroes were not welcome there. Now remember, this was a Catholic church established by the grace of God that excluded Black people solely because of skin color. And I would ask them, how could you remain Catholic when you were clearly not wanted? And their response was simple. That is not Jesus talking. However, this experience and others convinced my mother not to support a potential vocation for me to the priesthood. When I was in the local parish school, one of the priests was of African descent who complained bitterly to the Black parishioners that he was ostracized by the white priests. They would not eat with him or socialize with him. So he reached out to us, the Black community. When I thought about being a priest, my mother, as devout as she is, thought it was a waste of my life because I would not be accepted. She did not want that kind of hardship for me. Needless to say, I did not become a priest. And still today, my mother, at 97 years old, who is devoted to St. Jude and is incredulous if she misses the opportunity to receive the Eucharist, questions the commitment and the desire of the church leadership to recognize and welcome Black Catholics. For example, she has been a constant critic of the diocesan paper in the Diocese of Brooklyn, the tablet, for its lack of coverage in the African-American community. She always asks, do they know any Black people? It is my belief that in order to love beyond the limits of race, we should look to others, including the saints, for inspiration and guidance. As far as my foremothers are concerned, the most inspiring, loving, and saintly person they had ever met in the church who looked far beyond the limits of race was Monsignor Bernard Quinn, a priest of the Diocese of Brooklyn, who died in 1940 and was declared a servant of God and whose cause for sainthood now rests at the Vatican. Monsignor Quinn showed us how to love beyond race. He single-handedly started what we now call the Black Church here in the Diocese of Brooklyn. His life as a priest and as a Christian is a pure example of what it means to love beyond the limits of race. As a result of Black people not being welcome to worship in the diocese, he got permission, without much encouragement from his peers, to establish the first Black parish for Catholics in the diocese, which still stands today as a beacon of love beyond race. That is the Church of St. Peter Claver in Brooklyn, established in 1922. Ironically built across from what was then the Church of the Nativity that had excluded Black Catholics at the time and ultimately did not survive. And while St. Peter still stands as a mecca for Black Catholics, Nativity is now a Protestant church. Monsignor Quinn also established the Church of St. Benedict the Moor in Queens, which is also a part of Black Catholic history in the Diocese of Brooklyn. Monsignor Quinn has been quoted saying, "It surely is difficult to understand why anybody could refuse a bed and shelter to a homeless child, no matter what color or creed might be." He established what is now Little Flower Children's Services for homeless colored children in Wading River in the 1920s. Not being deterred by a fire at its complex in 1928 attributed to the Ku Klux Klan, which has served countless children and families for over 100 years. Monsignor Quinn's influence and accomplishments are impossible to quantify. His is a lasting legacy of love far beyond the constraints of racism. Even before him, there were efforts by Black Americans to be accepted and welcomed to the Catholic Church, as many believed in its truth. There's an excellent book entitled Uncommon Faithfulness by M. Sean Copeland that chronicles these efforts from the beginning of America and even before that. And she concludes this way: "The exploration has sketched the emerging realities of Black Catholicism in the 21st century within the US context. A main feature of this faith experience is the acknowledgement that due to the forces of globalization, Catholics of African descent have become part of the American church experience. We are challenged to build bridges to and from our neighborhoods and potential brothers and sisters in the Black Catholic struggle. The emerging conversation in the Pan-African world provokes a mutual reframing of identities as we explore the larger reality of the presence of Catholics of African descent in the American Roman Catholic Church. For example, a Ghanaian cardinal working in Rome becomes framed in the Western media as a Black cardinal. Or take the example of the canonization of St. Josephine Pekita, the first African female raised to statehood in almost 2 millennia, becomes a cause for celebration for both the African and the African Black Catholic world. The American Black Catholic world. In light of these experiences, a Pan-African Catholic lens allows an appreciation of the breadth and depth of religious living presented by 200 million Roman Catholics of African descent. Bridge building provides a paradigm through which to grasp this living richness. A global Pan-African Catholic vision emerges. And 100 years later, 100 years after a single priest from the Diocese of Brooklyn showed the world and the church what it means to live the gospel, where are we? While Monsignor Quinn is obviously not the only person or cleric that has lived the gospel, he is a clear example of what love can be uninhibited by race. I would ask you for a moment, dust off your copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church and look at Part 3, Article 3, which advances church teaching on social justice. While it is a treasure trove of church teaching, it can also provide a roadmap for looking at and respecting an individual regardless of race or any other irrelevant difference. Section 1931 reads, respect for the human person provides by way of respect for the principle that everyone should look upon his neighbor without any exception as another self, above all bearing in mind his life and the means necessary for living within it in dignity. No legislation could by itself do away with the fears, prejudices, and attitudes of pride and selfishness which obstruct the establishment of truly fraternal societies. Such behavior will cease only through the charity that finds in every man a neighbor, a brother. Therefore, it seems that racism can only be neutralized if there is an understanding of what it is, and after a self-examination of one's own conscience, consistent with the duty to put oneself in the shoes of the other. The issues associated with race and society seem to have no resolution and has been a constant drag on peoples around the world and on their ability to live as dignified, free persons. Our country continues to struggle with these issues. While racial understanding and tensions have ebbed and flowed through the years, an explosion of misunderstanding and tensions in ways just an event away. Such is the antithesis of love and a failure to follow Jesus's commandment to us to love one another as explained in the Catechism. As you know, I currently serve as Deputy Police Commissioner for Legal Matters in the New York City Police Department. I was born and raised in New York, and I grew up in Southeast Queens. I have served as a criminal court judge, an assistant district attorney, and a New York State Supreme Court justice. I am a man of faith and an ordained Roman Catholic deacon with a master's in theology. I'm also chair of a not-for-profit agency seeking to serve at-risk youth and their families, and previously served as chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. My mother was a teacher who retired at the age of 93. My dad was a pharmacist who grew up and worked all his life in Harlem. And one of my favorite childhood memories is going to work with him on Amsterdam Avenue, working the cash register and learning about life. And I always knew, even as a little boy, when I became a man, that no matter what position I ever held or my status and anything that I ever achieved, there was one invariable that remained. I am a Black man. And with this, the immutable characteristic of my skin color that often leads others to come to the automatic conclusion that I am a threat, or I am inferior, or I am not as smart as others, or I have to give respect rather than be respected. This is tragically part of the African-American experience. Some time ago, during the height of COVID restrictions, while walking with my daughter in the neighborhood in Queens where I live, have lived for 25 years, an older Asian woman saw me, was startled, and tripped in a desperate attempt to get away from me as quickly as possible. While I sat in Supreme Court in Queens, I distinctly remember getting into an elevator in the very court that I served, noticing the only occupant of the elevator was cowering in the corner, who happened to be an older white woman, afraid of my presence. While I served in criminal court, I saw several instances of arrests of young men of color that should never have happened, and they were adjudicated accordingly. As I watched the video of George Floyd being tortured and executed, I felt profound sadness and outrage. Sadness for his family, sadness for his community, and the outrage of every Black person who watched another Black man murdered because of bias. Law enforcement, for its part, has become a focal point of the national and international discussion regarding race relations, including whether the justice system itself suffers from institutional racism. However, the intersection of race and policing is much broader than disparate law enforcement. It is history, socioeconomics, institutional racism, disparities in educational opportunities, and access to healthcare, and so much more. Race and policing issues are just one of the manifestations of these and other inequalities, and a symptom of a much larger discussion of love beyond the limits of race. While George Floyd's murder and my experiences are incomparable, there are extremes on the same continuum of reality for communities of color. The civil unrest that exploded thereafter was a culmination of what communities of color and many others saw as a mark in the sand that racism should not and cannot be tolerated. The discussions that resulted from such unrest have been profound. Even in my own family, discussions among generations on race have been lively and provocative. All my experience have led me to consider that loving beyond the limits of race should be approached from two different directions. That is, that racism can be explicit or implicit, and in order to realize God's plan for us, we should recognize whether either or both exists in ourselves and others. Again, in order to love beyond the limits of race, we must constantly be aware of our own thoughts and actions in addition to those of others. How would you define racism, as a question that I asked at the beginning? Well, Pittsburgh State University defines it this way. They look at overt racism or explicit racism, which is the intentional and or obvious harmful attitudes or behaviors towards another minority individual or group because of the color of his or her skin. What does that include? It can include any speech or behaviors that demonstrate a conscious acknowledgement of racist attitudes and beliefs. It could be rooted in a white supremacy ideology, which seeks to reinforce and maintain. It could be distinguished by blatant use of negative attitudes, ideas, actions directed at non-white racial groups. Can be practiced by individuals, groups, institutions, and across societies. And covert racism is racial discrimination that is concealed or subtle rather than obvious or public. Acts to subvert, distort, restrict, and deny racial minorities access to societal privileges and benefits. A key figure of covert racism is that its disguised nature allows perpetrators to claim plausible deniability and to essentially gaslight their victims, that is to deny that the act was racist and undermine any claim of harm. May be implicit as a result of unconscious bias that exists within an individual, regardless of ill will or any self-aware prejudices. So, explicit bias is easy to recognize, right? Monsignor Quinn and his parishioners experienced overt racism. We've seen assaults on people in New York City because their race, particularly lately against the Asian community. That's overt racism. We've had the shooting and murder of Black people in South Carolina by a young white man because of race. That's overt racism. Implicit racism is a bit more difficult to recognize, and it's difficult to address. And one of the main reasons is that no one likes to admit that they are biased. Even people in the Ku Klux Klan don't think they are racist. Perhaps another concept to consider is what's called indifference to racism. And I came across an interesting article written by Dr. Peter Kranz, who is professor of psychology at the University of Texas, and he titled it Racial Indifference, Racism's Best Ally. And in part, he writes this: no more do I hear white liberals' outcries of the 1960s filled with racial concern and commitment, or even the anger of the white racists fearing Black encroachment upon their God-given rights. Instead, I hear new sounds, the best of which troubles my white consciousness even more, quieter in vocal tone, but deadlier in its effect upon the individual. These sounds are feelings of racial indifference coming forth from my own white students, indifference in their concern and commitment in recognizing, focusing upon, and coming to terms with either their own personal racism or that of the institutional variety which surrounds their very existence. It is as though these white students have been forced to give up within themselves. They have been beaten down by the system, beaten down by the futility of personal struggle to create change, beaten down by the lack of leadership within our governmental structure. And what is most tragic, beaten down even before they've had the chance to have an impact upon their own destiny, beaten down into plastic figurines, modeled and hardened to exemplify and accept that good old American ethic, racism. My friends, in order to love beyond the limits of race, we must examine ourselves, the way we think, the way we process information, the way we perceive things. Some time ago, I had the opportunity to I was in a retreat. I was a retreat master with in the Diocese of Brooklyn, the Diocese of Rockville Center, and it was a retreat for deacons. And one of the topic that I picked was the church's teaching on social justice. And what I used as a base was the catechism. And so here I was presenting to a bunch of deacons about social justice. And it's my belief that social justice in the church is inextricably linked to race and racial acceptance. That's the church teaching. And then we talked about various topics. We talked about immigration. We talked about helping the poor, all of which in our country today are linked to race. And it was interesting for me to see how my brother deacons reacted to this. If I remember correctly, I was the only Black deacon there, but there were some deacons of Latin descent. And the discussion that ensued was quite provocative and interesting. And I say that because one of the takeaways from this is that the church's understanding of what Scripture says sometimes seems to be a little bit lacking. Now, as a deacon, we go through a lot of training. Not everybody has a master's. I got a master's as part of that. But what struck me is that we have people who are clerics who do not necessarily understand what the church teaching itself is. As a Roman Catholic Church, we have an obligation to follow Scripture, not only to follow Scripture, but to live it, at least try to live it. I mean, that's our call as Christians, to follow Jesus. So I would ask you, and these are brother deacons, so I would ask you to consider, look at your own lives. Do you have a diverse group of friends? A lot of times, we grow up in neighborhoods and where people live who look just like us. So our ability to make friends of different races, of different ethnicities is somewhat limited. When I went to St. Francis Prep, and invariably, things, particularly in the lunchroom, were broken up by race and still are. If you go to St. Francis Prep, you go to many Catholic schools, in any Catholic school, you will see that a lot of things are broken up by race. I mean, this is something that we are conscious about, unconscious about, but these are the kind of things that we have to think about. I remember going to parties when I was younger, when I was in St. Francis, in white neighborhoods. I remember people giving me a hard time about that. Now you say, well, that happened a long time ago because I'm old, but not really. The incidents that I talked about earlier today just happened last year. It's about me being treated as some other person in my own neighborhood or in my own courthouse. So I'm not saying that certainly if you don't have a diverse group of friends, that means that you're racist. I'm saying, why is that? You have to think about that. How do you choose your friends? And how many friends do you have with different backgrounds from you? Have you ever assumed a person's intelligence based on their ethnicity or even their name? And that certainly is not only a racist situation, because we know that racism is a broader topic other than skin color. If you have a particularly black sounding name, whatever that means, that's something that may work against you trying to get a job or what have you. If you have there was a time when you had an Italian name. In fact, in the City University of New York, one of the protected groups in the university are Italian, people of Italian descent, because there was a history of discrimination. If you're white, how do you feel when two white kids are walking behind you? How do you feel if two black kids are walking behind you? And why do you feel that way? What assumptions do you have about white people? Whether you're white or black or what have you. What assumptions do you have about black people? What assumptions do other black people have about black people or Latin people or Muslims? And just as important, do you even care about racism? Do you ever think about it? I would think that those people here are participating today do think about it. And I thank you for being here, because race is something, and dealing with those issues is something that's never going to go away. It has been as part of this country from its beginning. It's been in this world since the beginning. It certainly is all through Scripture. And this is a topic that While it may never go away, it certainly can be dealt with a lot better than it has been. So I thank you for listening to me. And that concludes my remarks. Sister Mary Ellen.
Thanks, Ernie. Last week, when we were speaking about our understanding of God and our images of God, I was recalling a book that was very kind of notorious in 1973. It was written by a woman by the name of Mary Daly, a theologian and philosopher. And the book was called Beyond God the Father. As I said, the book was quite there was a lot of angst about this book. It was quite controversial, but there was a quote in it that I've often thought of, and I'd like to apply that to something that Ernie spoke about today. And Mary Daly said in her book, Beyond God the Father, if God is male, then male is God. And I'd like to say, if God is white, then white is God. Ernie talked about unconscious bias, and we all have those. And I think that for many white people, whiteness is the norm by which they view everything. And it's very hard for them to get into another worldview where whiteness is not the norm. So I'd like to tell you two stories today that are true to my life. And hopefully you can see something that comes out of these stories. And the first is an experience I had with a young woman named Cara, who was a member of St. Mary Magdalene Parish, a very, very gifted young woman. She was studying in the 3-year Pastoral Institute in the Diocese of Brooklyn to become a lay ecclesial minister. And one day after her class, Clara came to me and she said, I have to tell you what happened to me in class last night. She said, I started to cry in class. And I said, what happened? And she said, the teacher asked us, what was our image of Jesus and had it changed? And Cara said, the image I had of Jesus for most of my life was the picture of the Sacred Heart, because I went to Sacred Heart School, and that was the image that was all over the place. So that's what I thought of, that statue that we're all familiar with of the bleeding heart of Jesus. She said, when I was 18, and this is when I first met Cara, my family moved to Springfield Gardens, and we came to St. Mary Magdalene Church. She said, I remember the first Sunday I walked into that church, and I saw that statue of the risen Jesus as a Black man. It was the first time I understood that Jesus was human like me, and that I was made in the image of God. Cara had been to Catholic school for 12 years, and she had never seen Jesus imaged any way except as a white male. So Cara, in a sense, had been denied her right to image God. And I wonder how many other people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds have been denied their right to know that Jesus was human like them and that they image God. It reminded me of what Beth Johnson had talked about last week. I wonder if you think of your own parish church, your school or institution, what image of God is preached as soon as someone walks in the doors before a word is ever spoken? The second instance happened just a few years ago. St. Mary Magdalene Church burned to the ground, and that beautiful image of Jesus as a Black man was also destroyed. It took 6 years for the community to be able to rebuild the church. During those 6 years, we had to deal with the city of New York, which is not easy. We had to deal with the Diocese of Brooklyn, which is also not easy. And we also had to raise the money, which also is not easy. But after 6 years, we were very happy to have our beautiful new church. One of the people who worked on the church with us was a liturgical artist by the name of Larry Hoy, who was very sensitive to the fact that he was building a church for a Black Catholic community. And so all of our images are of Black people. We use African cloth. We use Caribbean cloth. Our altar was in the shape of a bowl. It's a very large bowl with a mesa on top, because in many African countries, people eat out of the common bowl. And again, it was a wonderful symbol of Eucharist to eat out of the common bowl. A few months after the church was open, Larry called me and said that he was working on a church in New Jersey, a suburban church in New Jersey. And the pastor there and the team who were working on the renovation of the church wanted to see some of his recent work. And he wondered if he could bring them to St. Mary Magdalene. I, of course, said he could, and they came on a particular day. And Larry brought them into the church and was pointing out some of the architectural features that he wanted them to note that he thought might be able to be reproduced in their church. The people were very enthused about the church. They were very inspired by it. They loved the church, and they asked a lot of good questions. And one of the men noted that the choir is in the front in the sanctuary in the church, but he said to me, "You don't have an organ." I said, "No, we don't have an organ," basically for two reasons. First of all, we couldn't afford one, but more importantly, we use an electronic keyboard. It suits our needs even better, so we're fine with that. And this gentleman must have been a musician, because he said to me, "You have the most beautiful set of drums." And we actually have two sets of drums, a regular set of drums and then the African drums. And the pastor who was with us said to me, "It must sound like a Baptist church in here on Sunday." And I said to him, "No, Father, it sounds like a Black Catholic church in here on Sunday." Again, his norm was whiteness. His norm not only of what God looks like, but how we worship. It is possible. There's a slogan in the Black community which says, "It is possible to be authentically Black and authentically Catholic." That we do not have to see everything through the same eyes. Racism and white privilege are killing our Black brothers and sisters. We white people, especially white Catholics, are being called to do something about it. In June 2020, an article appeared in the National Catholic Reporter, and it was by Fordham professor, Father Brian Massagill. And he wrote, "If it were up to people of color, racism would have been resolved over and done a long time ago. The only reason for racism's persistence is that white people continue to benefit from it." So I think that's a question we all need to ask ourselves. How do we benefit? How do we benefit from racism? And again, what are we as white Catholics being called to do about it? So again, I'd like to thank Ernie for sharing with us. And now I'd like to open this up to any questions or comments you might have. As I said earlier, discussing these things and grappling with them helps us all to grow and learn. So please don't be shy. And if you have any questions or would like to comment, we'd be glad to share them. So let me just open what we have here. One of the questions says, "Have you raised these issues with the leadership of the Diocese of Brooklyn? It appears there's an indifference to racism and the will to make concrete changes." Ernie, do you want to answer that about the commission that you were on for the diocese?
Yes, Bishop DiMarzio, who about I was still a judge, so maybe about 3 years ago, he created a commission on racial justice named after Monsignor Quinn. And its purpose was to initially go on a listening tour of the various parishes throughout the diocese, and to come back with a program. We were charged to come back with a program to address some of the concerns that people had, and we had these talks and presentations around the diocese. It morphed into dealing with racial issues in some of the high schools because as I said before, high schools are very hotbeds, if you will, of not only learning and everything, but you see how things break down on racial lines. So, and this was at a time particularly after, when the protests were happening. So the commission was very very active in trying to help solve some of these problems. As difficult as they are, and these are things, and I commend Bishop DiMarzio for recognizing that there is an issue, both a possibly systemic issue, but also, how do we deal with these things in the future? So certainly in our diocese, the Brooklyn Diocese, leadership has recognized that there are issues connected with race, and even Sister Maria and Sister Mary Ellen. I remember when I was in St. Paschal, the Sisters of St. Joseph were at the forefront of dealing with these issues, even in the 1970s and 80s. Very and still, my heart as a Roman Catholic boy belongs to the Sisters of St. Joseph because of their unbelievable passion for education and helping bridge the gaps that Black young men and women fell into because of racism. So I think our diocese has had a long history of recognizing, not that it didn't go away, but we have a history in the Diocese of Brooklyn of dealing with these issues head on.
Okay, Ernie, another question here to you. It says, Deacon Ernie, you said that racism has been with us forever and will probably never go away. If true, can there be any basis for hope among Black people?
Certainly, hope, faith is hope. Hope is faith. You always have to have hope. So while things may not completely vanish, things get better. And things certainly are better than they have been. When my mother was fighting to belong to a Catholic church, that's something that doesn't exist anymore. Or when I was in St. Paschal Baylon at the time, and the priests were not accepted as maybe a full member of the clerical state by the other priests assigned there at the time. That is not as big as that is not something that you see these days. So things improve, and things always improve. Certainly, racism in this country has improved. We had Barack Obama elected president. Now people say, well, he was elected president, therefore there's no racism. And we saw that as soon as, that's not true. And in my opinion, you saw as soon as he left office, I think people recognize that racism is still alive and well. So yes, things are better. Things can always improve, just like our faith. We are not perfect. We are all sinners, but we strive to be better. That's what Jesus taught us.
Oh, this is a hard one, Ernie. How, if you are living and ministering in a white parish with people who have chosen to live there, do you begin to raise these issues?
That is a very difficult question. One of the things that Sister Mary Ellen and I talk about all the time is that I have to know my audience. And so such a thing would have to be introduced very carefully. One of the things, I mentioned that when I was doing that retreat with my brother deacons, I used a catechism. I think the catechism is an excellent underused resource of the Catholic Church, because if you read it, a lot of these things are addressed. If you put out that question, if you read a part of the catechism that talks about taking care of the poor, let's say, a lot of times you don't necessarily have to say race. You can just say, what is your reaction to, the catechism on teachings of race? For my thesis, I wrote my thesis was on basically the difficulty of Catholic politicians, and we see that playing out today as well with abortion and what have you. But if you look at Scripture is very clear on what you do with people with immigration, with poverty, with helping people, right? But then when you put it in a political context, that's where things get kind of messed up. You know, the thing is, people, instead of their faith advising their politics, it's the other way around. And then when you mix politics with everything, that's when things go awry. So if you are in a white parish, my suggestion is invite people like me and talk about it. But, you know, it depends. The approach is extremely important. How you approach. Certainly, you can't start by saying, you know, everybody in here is racist. You can't do that, obviously, right? Nobody wants to admit that they're racist, and nobody, even in their own minds, would think that they were racist. I mean, there are reasons why people think the way they do, but you really have to get people to think about issues gradually, little by little. Now, sister, what do you think about that?
I think you gave a good answer, Ernie. And I think possibly one of the suggestions you gave was to have people like yourself, people, Black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, come and preach or come and give some kind of a talk. It doesn't have to be on a racial issue. It can be on something else, just so that white people see people of other races, other backgrounds as just as competent, as just as intelligent, as just as concerned for their children, as just as concerned for their health care as they are. If people saw people as having the same desires, as not as threats, somehow it's come through our history. How have we come to associate different races with fear? Where does that fear come from? And maybe even to talk, it's not about race, it's about fear. Why am I afraid of someone who is different than I am? You know, where does that fear come from? And maybe it's to have retreats together. Maybe it's to have, again, someone like Ernie, and I shouldn't say someone like Ernie, have someone from a different racial or ethnic background come in and preach a retreat. There are wonderful, wonderful preachers in the Black community. I think that the white community could learn a lot from seeing how Black people celebrate, from coming to Black liturgies. There's an expression I use all the time: once you have Black, you can't go back. I mean, once you've celebrated with the Black community, you understand how to celebrate in a very different way that's authentically Black. But I think white people could benefit from that. I think we could all benefit from the exchanges among each other. I just want to continue with some of these questions, Ernie. This one here says, thank you, Deacon Ernie, for your personal story and comments. I see the Diocese of Rockville Center has an office for Black ministry. Wondering, in your passion for social justice, and we've talked about this too, have you advocated for justice of the LGBTQ community, of which Black, brown people suffer even greater exclusions, in which Black, brown people suffer even greater exclusion? Ernie, you want to talk about
on a personal level? Yes. Certainly in the police department, one of the advantages that I have is in the police department is, even I'm at the top of the food chain, but I'm also a deacon, and the police department is very Catholic. And a lot of the folks that are active in that community are Catholic. And a lot of the chaplains are very much involved in that community as well. And I'll be truthful, that is a tricky situation because of not only the church teaching, but what we think is a church teaching, but also politics. Everything in the in every minority community is political. And to get through that, it's difficult. But, the Pope has said, open the door, if you will, to accepting people from all parts of society. And I think that still has to be encouraged. I wish it is difficult, unfortunately. But then again, advocating for Black Catholics used to be difficult too. That's what the problem that Monsignor Quinn had. So certainly, I'll continue to do what I do. It's not something that the church is going to start a commission on anytime soon. Although, as I said, I think the Holy Father has talked about the issue, and I think that there's certainly more discussion, as there should be, about accepting everybody. I just did a baptism for a couple. They were a lesbian couple. The church teaches, you don't deny people the sacraments. They promise to raise a child Catholic. The mother is Catholic. Well, the birth mother is Catholic. The other mother is Christian, and even in the registry, I put both down. I mean, I followed all the rules of the Catholic Church, so there is an acknowledgement, at least, that this exists, and that we are all people of God, and they have the right to, people have the right to worship and to bring up their children in the faith. So, and not many people know that, I'm sure, but that's, that's a good start. That's something that, we should encourage.
Okay. Racism often begins in the home. How do we have these important conversations with our children to help them understand the issues and move beyond? And how can we give parents valuable education that helps them teach their children about loving beyond racism?
Well, certainly when it comes to children, my own children, I have 3 children, and I've been always extremely direct. I do not beat around the bush with my children for anything, whether it's race, whether it's sex education, anything like. So with children, the best way, the way children learn is direct conversation and by example. They see their parents treating people properly, then they will do so too. If they see people, if they hear the talk that, oh, that person. Now, one of the worst things that you could tell me, and I've heard this, and even my daughter Alex, that sister knows, oh, well, I don't think of you as Black. Now, what is that saying? That's saying that, that Black people are a certain way and you're not like that. I think Black people are poor. I think people are not as smart as I am. I think Black people are bad. That's basically what it's saying. So to say that to me or to say that to any Black person, that indicates some degree of racism. Maybe not overt, maybe you don't think it's racism, maybe you think it's a compliment. But when children hear that, right, that's where they start to pick up cues as to that may develop into a more active racism in the future. And schools, the same way. There was a study done, numerous studies done, that children in school, they learn to the expectations, learn to whoever's teaching them, they learn to that person's expectations. So if you have low expectations of children, that's the way they're going to learn. They're going to not achieve as much as they can. So my way of dealing with things, and that may be the minority, but I like to talk about things head on. And if I may give another compliment, this is not the compliment Sisters of St. Joseph hour, but when I was in school, when I was in St. Paschal, and I graduated in 1972. And I'm so friendly with some of the sisters that I had, they were very, very upfront with so many things. Truth, right? Whether it was, I hate to say it, sex education, whether it was race. I remember dealing with, a really race issue that I didn't really understand, that my parents did. And at the time, my 4th grade nun, Sister Mary Bride, she got us into a situation where we understood what was going on. So I think, let's face it, where children are concerned, they're home, school. Both have to reinforce each other. Schools should have discussions with the parents. A lot of times parents don't want to talk about this because it's uncomfortable. So I think forums like this are very important. Maybe the school should have a forum like this to talk about these issues. The best way to talk about is when an incident happens. If an incident happens, either locally or in your school or in your parish or whatever, or even nationally. What kind of discussion did we have when George Floyd was killed? Right? These are the opportunities that one can take to talk about some of these issues.
This question is interesting, kind of followed up what you just said, Ernie. The person says, thank you, Sister and Deacon, for your frank and candid remarks. I believe we need more of it for progress to be achieved in addressing racism. As a high school teacher who was schooled in the pre-Vatican II notion of the white, blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, how radical can we be as educators in presenting to our students an image of God that is personal to them, whatever their race or gender?
Well, I don't know, Sister, but you and I always say, look at where Jesus came from. Jesus came from what is now the Middle East. It is impossible that he had blonde hair and blue eyes. That's not the way people look in the Middle East, right? We know that came, when Europeans came over, we know that's how Jesus got this image of the white with the blonde hair and blue eyes. Just talk about history. Make Jesus is everything to everybody. We don't know what Jesus really looked like. But we do know it's unlikely that he looked like the image that we're talking about, but it really doesn't matter because Jesus has to look like, we know that God, we are all created in the image of God. So therefore we all look like him, right? And I think if we approach it that way, then I think we would be better off.
I'd like to chime in on that. And I have to, Ernie and I have this little discussion all the time. We either look like God, him or her.
Yes.
God. We use
Yes.
God. We talk about God.
Yes.
Okay. But also to just say, it was what I spoke about before when I talked about Kara, who for 12 years went to Catholic school and had never seen an image of God or Jesus in anything except what you described, the questioner, as a white, blue-eyed male. And I think that in our schools, in our churches, if we could just have varied expressions of art. I often worship now at St. Francis Xavier Church in Manhattan. And they are in the midst of a project right now. They have hired an artist, and the artist has been commissioned to do 12 portraits of saints that are going to go around the sides of their church, because they realize that all the imagery in their church is like that white image. And so these 12 saints are from varied ethnic and racial traditions, and they're all going to be represented around the side of the church, just for that purpose, that holiness is not contained in one group or one people. So I think if our schools should have the varied pictures of Jesus and God and Mary, they can come from all different traditions. I think also in literature, we certainly can teach that in the literature that we use with our young people. In schools, there's not just, do we just use Black authors or Latino authors during Black History Month or Latino History Month? Black literature is American literature. Latino literature is American literature. Why isn't that part of our regular curriculum? So I think there are just lots of ways to broaden it. Again, when we have school liturgies, can't we have hymns from different traditions? Have a hymn in Spanish, have a spiritual, have a gospel song. I mean, there's so much that we can do to enrich our young people, to learn the fullness of our Catholic tradition, not just the one tradition that we may worship in every Sunday, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we can broaden our experience of that. So thank you for that question, and thank you for being open to do that. There was another question that was up here. I'm sorry, I'm going back because I skipped around here a little bit. And one of them, I don't understand the question, so I can't ask it. There's a very long one here. I'm going to try and read it. I'm not quite sure. It says, Robin DiAngelo speaks of individualism and universalism in respect to racism in her writings. White fragility and nice racism. Whites see themselves outside of race, for whites see themselves as individuals, which denies the significance of race and the advantage of being white privilege. Universalism assumes that white people and racialized people have the same reality. She has more to say about individualism and universalism, which is to the advantage of whites and the disadvantage to the people of color. Do you have a comment on that, Ernie? Did you quite understand that? I know it was a lot to read.
There's a lot to consider too.
Yeah.
I mean, that you could do a whole thing on that one. Well, I mean, if I get what that statement was, basically that white people don't think about race. That basically mean in a sense, they are the race and everybody else.
Right. They don't see themselves as having race. It's
Right.
race is something that everybody else has.
Yes.
Yeah,
But if you
because
do that-
whiteness is the norm.
Yeah, but if you do that, that says that everybody else who's not white is different.
Yeah.
And then when you classify somebody as different, that's when you get problems. So yeah, that statement has to be dissected a bit much, certainly beyond what we're doing here.
Yeah. Thank you, Ernie. I just got a note from Maria, our little host, saying that we have to begin to wrap this up here now. So I want to thank everyone who is with us tonight. I want to thank Ernie for sharing so much with us. I want to thank you all for being with us, for your questions, which were very good. And I hope this isn't the last discussion we have on this topic, because as we all agree, it's an important one. We are going to meet again, those of you who would like to join us on October 27th. The topic will be Loving Beyond the Limits of Gender and Sexual Orientation. There are two programs this month, this one tonight and the second one on October 27th. There will then be one in November and one in December. So again, thank you so much for being with us, and wish you all a blessed night.